Our second presentation examines the nature of incentives used in business schools and the implications for the business school's health overall. This is an important topic, not only for all of us, because the authors also show that it affects the quality of our research in important ways. So I think it's pretty interesting how these two topics can fit together, these two papers on improving our research. I know that Chris extended an invitation to over 200 deans across the world. So hopefully we'll get some questions from the deans at the end and we'll have a fruitful conversation. So with this, I'd like to welcome Stefan, Russ, Nuno, and we look forward to your talk.
You are no.
Okay, thank you so much, Rob. I hope you can hear me all. Ross, if you can hear me, I see your video, so if you can do a thumbs up. Yeah, great. First of all, thank you, Chris, for the opportunity to present our work in this webinar series. And thank you also especially to you, Rob. I think this is a bit of a special paper. And we greatly benefited from your stewardship as the handling editor. So, so thank you a lot for all your help throughout the process. By the way, I mean, behind me, you see a drawing. We will actually send a picture of that to Chris and to all of you. Nuno is a very good cartoonist, so he made a cartoon especially for the session of today. So that we'll send separately. I want to kind of break up the talk in a couple of pieces. So I'll first say something about the motivation, why we started doing something like this. Actually, this paper goes back to a meeting that I had with Ross in the corridors at Erasmus, where he was heading the review audit committee. And I was one of the fellows of the Institute reporting to that audit committee. And we started to talk like, isn't it strange that we do these audits in the way that we do them? So that led us ultimately to the study that then also Nuno joined, and we had a blast. So I'll first say something about the motivation for the study, because this thing has been around a bit over time. Then I'll go through the conceptual piece that we built. I'll talk a bit about the empirics we have and then and the findings we have. And then I want to kind of stimulate some discussion at the end with some of the implications that we see this work could have. And for some reason, you know, this thing is not clicking. Okay, so if you look back, there is quite a lot of work in marketing also, but also in other disciplines that actually already questions like what kind of research are we doing as academics in marketing, and is that really helping or hurting actually business school environments? There's a lot of questioning on the drift in publication, like the counting and the gaming and kind of just producing mechanically a high quantity of papers. But there's also things about relevance and are we really doing the research that we're supposed to do? And that comes a bit back later on. So if you derive a couple of hazards that people have mentioned about the research that we've been doing, one hazard clearly is that we're putting quantity first and quality second. So it seems like easily available metrics have maybe pushed us towards kind of doing kind of repetitive high quantity of work, but not necessarily high quality work. So you have these things like salami publishing. I don't know if you heard about that term. That's really when you have a project and then you wonder how to slice the salami in as many slices as possible that you can then send to different journals, and then you have more publications in the end, but in the end you didn't really do anything more important. You have this great paper in Nature also, which I will recommend you to read, and that kind of talks about hyperprolific scholars. And these are scholars that turn out like a paper every 5 days. And then they go into like, is that normal? Could this happen? And actually we see the same thing sometimes in marketing, that some people that have very high productivity on some productivity lists, then maybe later they get actually questioned in scientific fraud and integrity type of cases. So also in marketing, we had our fair share. I mean, also other disciplines, of course, but we also had our fair share as to how this quantity rush actually led us, or led some researchers to quite questionable research practices like data fabrication, p-hacking, harking, all of these things. No? So there's a bit of a risk there. The second risk, and that you see also a lot, is that once people are incentivized to publish quality and really to go with this quality, we define quality actually quite unidimensionally as what people call R quality, which is really the rigor part, which is really like, say, the pure science type of part. And we kind of, what you see is more and more criticism that we're kind of forgetting the other side of quality, which is more the practical importance, which people have called Q quality. And so there is kind of these two dimensions to quality. Like this is we won't disclose any school names. So, but like it's maybe best expressed by this dean of research at the left, who says like, it seems every marketeer wants to be a social scientist and wants to stop selling cookies. I mean, there are a lot of marketing scholars that fundamentally do not study marketing topics anymore and just look at topics that are generic social science research topics. And it of course boils up the question, like, to what extent are we harboring in marketing people from other disciplines that like to publish in other disciplines, which per se is a good thing, but could that become maybe too much of a good thing and actually result into a bad thing? And that's a kind of second hazard. The third hazard is that we're kind of, in our research drift in business schools, are quite defining what is healthy for the school quite narrowly from almost like a self-serving interest. We like research, so the business school is in great health if it does great research, and it's not in great health if it doesn't do great research. But if you've been a bit behind the bench in a business school, then there are many, many different sides of the operation beyond research, and research is only a very small part of what makes a school possibly healthy or not, right? Of course, there is teaching health, which we can define at a technical level, but there's also these things at the institutional level, like donor activity, external stakeholder activity, institutional integrity, right? Are we having all these student ethic cases, and then should we relate them to the science ethic case that we see among the professor corps, for instance? Is there some link there, maybe, right? And then also the managerial levels, like things like how well is our leadership established in business schools? Do we have good admin support? Do we have good resources, right? And that we kind of combine in this paper in a concept we call business school health, which is derived from education literature, where they have looked at this health principle in elementary and middle schools. And we try to kind of translate that to a business school level to make a more holistic kind of all over kind of concept of health that goes beyond that research health phenomenon. A final piece that we want to look a bit at, and that is also a clear hazard, there's been increasing concerns that faculty in business schools are overpaid. And that's maybe not good to hear for most of the people in the webinar. Maybe some people in the webinar actually say, finally, somebody is saying that from their own discipline. But it seems like we're paying people quite a lot, and we're seemingly paying them quite a lot for actually a research activity. And you kind of wonder, is that model going to sustain? And there's actually quite some expression that this may be a problem, that this may be a problem, and that this may be unsustainable. What we do, we build a conceptual framework grounded in social agency theory, where we actually look at university and business school systems as a collective principle that steers faculty. And there are, of course, multiple collective principles. There are multiple universities, multiple business schools, and there is some social monitoring going on back and forth between these schools. Outside that system, we conceptualize what is very typical in social agency. We also conceptualize what we call external institutions that are as well. And these are called endorsement institutions and cohesion institutions. And in the paper, we go to great length to actually explain how they look in the marketing field. What we then built is a bit like a path model. We basically say, well, we have on the left, we have this faculty research incentive system. Basically, the business school as a collective principle is monitoring what faculty publish, and they're paying faculty to do that. And that leads to a certain task execution of faculty. Faculty produces a certain quantity of research and is doing that at a certain level of quality, defined either to this rigor and this R quality or this Q quality, which is the importance. And the research that they generate is then leading to, let's say, health outcomes of the business school, which can be, on the one hand, let's say, very technically research and teaching, but also has an effect on all, or possible effect on all of these other dimensions of business school health. What do we do empirically? We have done a survey among 234 marketing academics, casting a net, let's say, across most business schools. I mean, let's say, I think we have like 80% of the top 100 Financial Times business schools, and we're also pretty global in our reach. We combine that with interviewing deans and associate deans, and we also combine that with interviewing several representatives of these external stakeholders that I talked about, these external institutions, which are these endorsement and cohesion institutions. What do we find? First finding, we find very confirmatory evidence that research incentives are misaligned. So it seems like our agency framework is a bit broken in the sense that faculty does not feel that the writings are monitored, and they don't feel that the writings, that they are compensated in the right way. For the first element of the monitoring, we actually will see that deans very much agree with this kind of logic. We will see for the compensation part that there's this interesting divide that faculty feels underpaid and deans feel that they're overpaid, which is kind of interesting also in terms of misalignment. What we see, especially from the monitoring, is that easily available metrics, they're like things you can easily yank out of Web of Science or Google Scholar, like how many papers did somebody publish, how many citations did somebody have, that these are probably a bit overused, and that the more difficult things to measure, let's say literacy, it came up actually in the previous talk already, creativity, the relevance to a non-academic audience like this practical importance is actually underrated. So we probably are weighing a lot what we can easily measure, and we're probably underweighing what is a bit more qualitative, what's a bit more harder to measure, right? What's also surprised us a bit is that faculty is crying out for more performance-based pay. And one can actually question whether that can be a bit of the solution to the divide beyond other solutions between these that feel that faculty are overpaid and faculty that says pay us for performance, right? So question mark there. But we feel quite a lot of misalignment. The second thing is what we feel is what's the consequence of this misalignment is actually bad research quality. So what we see is that schools where the incentives are more misaligned actually show lower research quality. They show a little bit lower research quantity, but they seem to be especially deficient on research quality. And that's what you can see in these graphs. Here we show actually the average misalignment. So meaning a bigger number is more misalignment in these cells. And what you of course can see, we're very much trained to look at these matrices and to look at cross columns, cross rows. What you of course can see is that the difference across the rows is bigger than the difference across the columns. Meaning that if the system is misaligned, it has a much more destructive influence on the research quality of the school than of the research quantity of the school. And that's of course normal because the misalignment is in the counting, right? So misaligned schools typically excessively count, right? And we thought that was kind of an interesting thing as well, because that shows if you can change, let's say in a high quantity, low quality school, if you could change the metrics to become much more informative to quality, they would actually drive up the quality, which is exactly what the deans want, especially for Q quality, right? The third thing we find is that if we look across the dimensions of business school health, is that if you look here by the numbers, you can see the number one is the green boxes. What you there see is if you have a school that publishes a lot of research, maybe academics feel that that's a sign of research quantity. But what we also find, research quality, but what we also find is that academics in these systems, they report low institutional support of external stakeholders. So low donor activity, low grant giving, all of these things, low endowments. So that means that research schools that fabricate continuously like a factory almost, research in high volumes, but lacking quality, may find themselves that they're great, but may actually be punished by the external world out there, like major donors. What you see in the second box, that's the blue box, is actually that quality pays off big time, much more than quantity. So quality pays off in many foundational dimensions of business school health, like external support, institutional integrity, higher quality research environments also are able to better transmit an ethical system to their students, right? And it pays off in leadership support, admin support, and resource support. The third thing you find is very interesting, I think, is the red box. What you see is that rigor pays off for research health, Q quality or practical importance pays off in the classroom, right? And that's why it's absolutely fundamental for marketing research to get its Q quality up and to become, again, much more practically important. And I think Journal of Marketing is actually a great marketplace for that basic concept, to publish very, very important papers that can change the world, because that will not only positively affect other dimensions of business school health, but it's something that we can, as professors, take in the classroom and become better because of it. The last element is the compensation. This is a couple of statements that actually just demonstrate that deans are fed up with it. They feel that they're overpaying faculty. It's all fixed salary. It's too much, right? And so they say, like, people come out with their hands all the time. I do not get it. It's just wrong. And so there seems to be a limit to what we can earn as faculty members, which is maybe not what we want to hear, but that's what we found. Then some solutions we can adopt, but then I'm going to wrap up, and that these could be issues I think that Rob or Chris could moderate also in discussion. What we feel is very important is we need to incentivize quality more than quantity, right? That means allocate more research funding, not on a list of like how many papers did you publish or how many citations did you amass, but what really is the foundational quality of your work. We need to really go also and train scholars and actually started an initiative that actually helps to train people in creativity tooling that companies are using to actually start to ideate on research topics. We also need to develop better research metrics that better balance research quantity and research quality. And in the paper, we give a couple of real suggestions how this actually can be done. We also need to incentivize research with higher practical importance, right? I mean, I'm a great proponent of being more like a law school or medical school and actually push people to practice what they preach. At the MA Doctoral Consortium, I once said that apparently marketing scholars are the only ones that believe that they can learn from not doing, which is a bit of a strange sentence to say. We are learning by not doing. So what we preach is maybe people should do a little bit more in the practical world to come to more balancing with their academic work. And the final piece is we need to get better at aligning the goals of research faculty with those of the business school. I mean, things like teamwork inside schools, within school collaborations. Can we get faculty to better understand the school's business model? I mean, at the essay, for instance, the school widely displays all the operational details and all the finances of what the school goes to. And that means that faculty gets like a much better grasp of where do I stand in the bigger picture, right? Which of course faculty is not great at that times. And Ross told us a story about his dean kind of gives this life in a dean session, where the dean actually explains what did my day look like, right? To actually get a better understanding of what is happening at that level. So these are a couple of the solutions that we see to this problem. The paper has many more, and the discussion can have many more. But that's a bit where I may leave it off. And Rob, I'll give the floor back to you, I think. And then Ross and Nuno, please, with questions, jump in at any time. No?
Well, thank you very much for some important insights. It was very interesting. Now we have some time to take some questions from the audience. To do so, as we did in the previous paper, there's a Q&A tab on the right, so you can just enter your questions there. But I had actually one I wanted to kind of kick it off with. What kind of behaviors have you observed from this excessive focus on quantity? What's the behaviors, and how does it exactly work, this destructive influence on the excessive focus on quantity? Since it seems like that's one of the big takeaways, this focus on quantity.
You know, that's interesting. This is Russ. Interesting question, Rob. Stefan will know this. I don't know if this came in later versions of the paper that Nuno would know, but I actually was curious about the change in the number of co-authors on papers over a long period of time. I can remember, I'll confess, I was a doctoral student back in the 1970s, mid to late 70s, and there seemed to be more single-authored papers than there are today. And I actually did an analysis in 5-year chunks in all the major journals. And indeed, there's a dramatic decrease in single-authored papers over the years. And also, I think we tend to know in the field people that tend to, add their names to papers when maybe they're less than deserving. They collect the data, they get the data set, but they don't contribute to the paper. Again, a lot of us know instances like that. I'm not saying that the decrease in single-authored papers is only due to people wanting to have fatter CVs. There are alternative explanations, but I think a number of observations that I had seem to indicate that over time, there's a lot more interest in scholars interested in increasing numbers. And in fact, at the AMA Doctoral Consortium, I would often get asked questions, well, how many A's does it take to get tenure at place X? Which I found to be an extremely interesting question to be asked, and certainly not relevant to what the scholar should be doing. So I think it's kind of anecdotal, a little bit analytical, but I think that there's a lot of evidence that there has been an increase in looking at just total quantity and a little bit less interested in either Q or R quality, as Stefan put it.
Yeah, and one thing that we can do, I think, Rob, I mean, we can maybe give the panelists, the people that joined, also a link, because we have the prior working papers of every single version we have online as a working paper. And one of these working paper versions shows the statistic on the single authored papers that Russ is referring to. And you see indeed a vast decline of number of co-authored papers. A vast decline of single authored papers, right? You see other things also. I mean, the most shocking anecdote that I have for you is from a person that has published in major journals repeatedly and is working at quite a respectable European business school that I won't disclose the name of. And when I had a conversation with him, he actually shared with me the following. He said, like, yeah, I mean, you know, my flow, because we were in a recruiting type of discussion. And he said, like, yeah, I have one more paper coming that I just need to turn around once and then it will be accepted. But I'm waiting to resubmit that until next year, because then it will count for my bonus. And then I make the bonus this year and next year. And now it comes, which is even better for my taxation. So this was a guy managing the numbers from a taxation on his bonus perspective, right? And then I was thinking like, man, something must be seriously wrong here, right? If a system does this to a person that intrinsically I think is a good scholar, right? So there are many signs.
Yeah, we had a question from the audience from Laura. I'm trying to understand the contributing factors to the misalignment in perceived compensation from the dean's view and the employee's view, the faculty view. If you had any more insights into that.
Nuno, you want to maybe address that or?
So we observed a larger difference in this between perceived and actual compensation in international schools and in non-top tier schools. So if we had to indicate what would be the root cause, I would say it could be indeed the time spent on research. So the research intensity.
I think the concern that, I think concern that we have is that most of the effort in the monitoring phase particularly is on what we called low effort metrics, and not only counting publications, but also citations, and citation counts with paper counts are things that all review committees for promotion, et cetera, look at these days. But Stefan had an earlier paper looking at the fallacy of looking at citations. And I think that, you know, if you want to look at the big picture, I think what we're pushing for deans to do, and I've been research dean and a number of other positions like that, is to just look at more effortful kinds of contributions that faculty make. It does take more time to evaluate creativity. It does take more time to evaluate originality, all right, and contribution. But I think we're seeing, and the deans corroborated this movement towards the low effort metrics like paper counts and citations, and a little bit away from the more effortful kinds of evaluations that are necessary. And so if we're looking for advice to deans, and in terms of also part of compensation, I think, you know, sometimes less can be more, all right, in what we're talking about.
Great. A question from Mark Houston was, it's hard for faculty in different departments to evaluate the quality of research outside their area. What quality metrics do you think are easiest to do kind of at the college level, research support level?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I've been in that situation myself, and I actually, I see that argument being used, but I don't know if it's true. Is it really that hard inside our own schools to assess the importance of somebody in another field? I would wonder, right? Because I once had this question, like, I mean, we had a discussion about a new chair appointment as a monetary economist. And I had some concerns with the file because of quality, because the guy had like a couple of papers and they basically only showed that firms are trying to evade taxes, right? That doesn't sound too important to me. And then I got like the feedback, yeah, but you're not from the field, right? Shouldn't we become a bit more generalistic? Because if we are in a situation that you actually feel that a marketing professor is not anymore able to say about an accounting professor, if they're doing relevant or important work or not, what does that say about us as marketing professors, right? How do we then do in, like, say, executive education programs? where a certain level of general management experience is desired. No? So I think that could be rather a symptom of the problem that I would start to buy through, because I think if we have the same thing in marketing, right? Like, we then have people assessing files of a modeler, and they all need to be modelers, and then the CB people assess CB people. But why do we have this silo type of thinking? It is a great school that we studied, and what they actually did is they allowed people to send in reference letters from any area. So from any field of the school, even secretaries could write a letter in support of a certain promotion. Students could write, external people could write, which meant that actually the committee got like a stack typically of 90 letters. I think that's great. The more diverse the input, the better, right? So I would say maybe let's do the opposite, Mark, and let's embrace that diversity, let's embrace that problem. Because if we accept that as a problem, I think the problem is way bigger than I actually thought, because that basically tells us that we don't know anything about business anymore. And that's pretty terrible. I'm not sure if you wanted to say that, but I hope not. Yeah.
Okay, maybe time for one more question, kind of combining a couple people's question here is, how much do you think this is driven by both the rankings and the accreditation organizations? Financial Times uses the input of how many papers published by a certain school in the previous year as one of their inputs into their rankings. And so it's not just the metrics done by the school, it's actually being pushed down from other outside organizations.
I would say a lot. Okay, a short answer. You know, if I do no work on a paper but get the data set and I get my name on the paper, that counts towards like FT, rankings in terms of I have a publication in that journal, and I would say that that some of the rankings that incorporate research, not all of them do, definitely have had an impact on incentive systems. In fact, in the UK, they have this, every 5 years? Some people might know better than I do. I think every 5 years they do a research assessment, the RAE, I think it's called, research assessment exercise, where basically they go and they just, count the number of papers that the faculty in the schools had. And, obviously that's not consistent with what we'd like to see happen. Can I make one more quick comment,
ahead,
Rob?
Russ.
There was a question in there about the impact on doctoral programs. And I know that in earlier versions of this, Stefan, I think you would agree, we really looked a lot at PhD programs and the impact of these kinds of issues on doctoral education. And I think in a lot of ways, the way you can change the value system is through the doctoral programs, doctoral education. And I think that, we talked about the need maybe for more of an emphasis on just take a course on, for example, in creativity or history of science. And if you have a seminar series where you bring in outside speakers, maybe sprinkle in a practitioner now and then. These kinds of things can make a big difference at the entry level of people's careers. And I know some of that used to be done more than it's done today. And so we think that, in fact, doctoral education is a good place to start with trying to change sort of attitudes towards the effortless metrics that we referred to before.
Great, thanks. Well, I want to extend everybody's thanks to Stefan, Russ, and Nuno for a great presentation and a topic. I found it really interesting.